Elena Matthews watched through her kitchen window as her husband of 15 years loaded his designer suitcases into Victoria Sterling's silver Bentley, and for the first time in months she smiled, because he had no idea she'd already begun dismantling everything he thought made him untouchable. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. The morning light filtered through the pristine windows of 47 Millbrook Lane, casting long shadows across the marble countertops Elena had once loved. Now, as she stood in her silk robe, hands wrapped around a coffee mug that cost more than most people's monthly groceries, the luxury felt hollow. Cold. The kitchen that had once been her sanctuary, where she'd prepared countless meals with love, hosted dinner parties that made David's business partners feel like family, now echoed with 15 years of memories that suddenly felt like lies. She watched her husband through the window, his movements sharp and efficient as he loaded another Hermes bag into the Bentley. David Matthews, successful architect, pillar of the community, loving husband, at least, that's what their Christmas cards proclaimed. The man she'd supported through graduate school, through the lean years when his firm was just a dream, through the sleepless nights when blueprints covered their dining table and Chinese takeout was their fine dining. Elena. His voice startled her from behind. She didn't turn around. The papers are on the hall table, she said quietly, her reflection ghost-like in the window glass. I've already signed them. A pause. She could feel his discomfort radiating across the kitchen like heat from an oven. Good. This doesn't have to be ugly, David said, and she almost laughed at the absurdity. Nothing about this was beautiful anymore. Finally, she turned. At 42, David still looked like the ambitious graduate student she'd fallen in love with, except now his hair was professionally styled, his clothes tailored by designers whose names she couldn't pronounce, and his eyes held a distance that money couldn't measure. When had she stopped recognizing the man she'd married? Ugly. Elena's voice was steady, conversational. David, you're leaving me for the woman next door after 15 years of marriage. We're well past ugly. He had the grace to look ashamed, but only for a moment. Victoria and I. It's not what you think. She understands the pressure I'm under, the expectations. The expectations of maintaining your lifestyle? Elena interrupted, setting her mug down with deliberate precision. Don't worry. I understand those expectations too. Better than you know. Something in her tone made him pause. For just a second, she saw a flicker of the man who used to trace her face in the morning light, who used to tell her she was his anchor in a world that demanded too much. But then Victoria's car horn gave a delicate honk from the driveway, and the moment shattered. I have to go, he said, picking up his final bag. His laptop case, she noted. The one that held all his work files, his business contacts, his entire professional life. How trusting of him. Yes, Elena said softly. You do. After he left, the silence in the house felt different. Not empty, expectant. Like a theater before the curtain rises. Elena walked to her home office, a small room David had never paid much attention to, dismissing it as her hobby space where she managed their household finances and volunteer work. If only he knew. The computer screen glowed to life, revealing spreadsheets, bank statements, and documents that painted a very different picture of David Matthews than the one his business partners saw. Elena had always been good with numbers, a skill David had conveniently forgotten when it served his ego to be the sole breadwinner. But she'd never stopped learning, never stopped growing, even as he'd grown distant. Have you ever discovered someone wasn't who you thought they were? How did it change your perspective on trust? 3 months. That's how long she'd known about Victoria, how long she'd been preparing for this moment. Not preparing to beg or fight for a marriage that had become a performance, but preparing for something else entirely. Something David, in all his arrogance, would never see coming. Through the window she could see Victoria's mansion next door, its windows like golden eyes in the morning sun. Victoria Sterling, tech mogul, widow, woman who collected beautiful things, including, apparently, other women's husbands. At 55, Victoria was still stunning, still powerful, still able to make men like David feel special, important, chosen. But Elena had learned something in her quiet months of investigation, something that would have made David reconsider if he'd been paying attention to anyone other than himself. Victoria Sterling's empire was built on foundations far shakier than anyone knew. And Elena Matthews, the invisible wife, the woman who'd been dismissed and discarded, had just become the most dangerous person in both their lives. She opened her laptop and began to type. The first email was to David's biggest client, Meridian Properties. The subject line read, "Regarding the Sterling Development Project, urgent legal concerns." Elena smiled as she typed, remembering every dinner party, every casual conversation, every moment when Victoria and David thought the quiet wife wasn't listening. They'd underestimated her completely. And that, she reflected as she attached the first of many documents that would change everything, was going to be very expensive for them both. When did you realize that the person hurting you had given you exactly what you needed to protect yourself? Share your moment of clarity. The Meridian Properties boardroom fell silent as Elena Matthews finished her presentation. 23 floors above downtown, with the city sprawling beneath the floor-to-ceiling windows, she stood at the head of the mahogany table in her navy suit, the one David used to say made her look too serious, and watched as 12 of the city's most powerful developers absorbed what she'd just revealed. "Mrs. Matthews," Harrison Meridian's voice cut through the silence like crystal. "You're telling us that the Sterling Development Project, our $40 million investment, is built on fraudulent environmental reports?" Elena clicked her remote, and another document appeared on the wall screen. "Not just fraudulent reports, Mr. Meridian. Falsified soil samples, bribed inspectors, and hidden geological surveys showing the Riverside District is built on unstable ground. Ground that will shift within 5 years, making every building there uninhabitable." The silence stretched taut as piano wire. Elena could hear her own heartbeat, could smell the leather chairs and coffee that had grown cold during her 90-minute presentation. 3 months of careful investigation, of late nights cross-referencing public records David thought she'd never understand, of following paper trails that led back to Victoria Sterling's web of shell companies and paid officials. "How did you obtain these documents?" Another board member asked, his voice carefully neutral. Elena's smile was small, controlled. "My husband, David Matthews, your lead architect on the project, never changed the passwords on his work accounts after we married. For 15 years, I've had access to every email, every file, every supposedly confidential communication." She paused, letting the weight of that settle. "Including his correspondence with Mrs. Sterling about concealing the geological reports." The room erupted in low murmurs, shuffling papers, the scratch of expensive pens on notepads. But Elena kept her eyes on Harrison Meridian, watching his face transform from confusion to understanding to something that looked very much like fury. "Mrs. Matthews," he said finally, his voice deadly quiet, "do you understand what you're telling us?" "I'm telling you that my husband and Victoria Sterling have conspired to defraud your company of $40 million while putting thousands of future residents at risk." Elena's voice never wavered, though her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the laser pointer. "I'm telling you that they planned to take their profits and disappear to Victoria's property in Monaco before the ground shifts became apparent." "And why?" Harrison leaned forward, his steel-gray eyes intense. "Are you telling us this now?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Elena felt the eyes of every person in that room on her, felt the weight of this moment that would change everything. Not just for David and Victoria, but for her. For the first time in months, she thought of the woman she'd been that morning, standing in her empty kitchen, watching her marriage drive away in a Bentley. Because, she said quietly, some betrayals are too expensive to ignore. Harrison Meridian nodded slowly, then turned to his assistant. Cancel the Sterling contracts. All of them. And get legal on the phone. I want to know our options for recovery. When someone underestimated you completely, how did it feel to prove them wrong? Tell us about your moment of justice. As the boardroom emptied, Harrison approached Elena. Mrs. Matthews, I have to ask, what do you want from this? Are you looking for revenge against your husband? Elena gathered her papers, her movements precise and calm. Through the window, she could see the city where David was probably showing Victoria around his new office, where they were probably planning their future with stolen money. Mr. Meridian, I spent 15 years being invisible in my own marriage. I watched my husband dismiss every opinion I had, every contribution I made, every time I tried to be a partner instead of just a wife. She looked up at him, and for the first time in the conversation, her voice carried the edge of real emotion. This isn't about revenge. This is about consequences. Harrison's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then at Elena, something like respect dawning in his expression. My legal team says we have grounds for a $40 million fraud lawsuit. If we win, and with this evidence, Sterling's assets will be frozen pending investigation. All of them? Elena asked. Every account, every property, every investment. And your husband, as the architect who signed off on the falsified reports. Harrison paused. He'll be named as a co-defendant. Elena nodded, feeling something cold and final settle in her chest. In the span of 2 hours, she had just destroyed 2 lives as methodically as David destroyed buildings to make room for new construction. The thought should have horrified her. Instead, she felt oddly peaceful. There's one more thing, she said, reaching into her briefcase. Victoria's planning to transfer her liquid assets to offshore accounts this afternoon. She's meeting with her private banker at 3 p.m. at First National. If you move quickly. Harrison stared at her. How could you possibly know that? Because, Elena said, allowing herself a small, genuine smile, she told my husband about it last night. And my husband tells me everything in his sleep. Some habits die hard. As she walked to the elevator, Elena felt her phone vibrate. A text from David, having lunch at the club with Victoria. Don't wait up tonight. We're looking at properties in Monaco. She typed back, enjoy Monaco. You might want to look into extradition laws while you're there. But she didn't send it. Instead, she deleted the message and wrote, have a wonderful day, darling. Some surprises, after all, were worth waiting for. The elevator doors closed, and Elena caught her reflection in the polished steel. The woman looking back at her was someone she barely recognized. Not the quiet, accommodating wife who had spent 15 years making herself smaller to fit into David's vision of their life, but someone stronger. Someone who had just moved the first piece on a chessboard her husband didn't even know he was playing on. By evening, the news would break. By tomorrow, David and Victoria's world would be in ruins. And Elena Matthews, the woman they had both forgotten to consider, would finally be free to discover who she was when no one was underestimating her anymore. The elevator reached the ground floor, and Elena stepped out into the sunlight, already planning her next move. Victoria Sterling's penthouse office commanded a view of the entire city, but at 4:17 p.m., she wasn't admiring the skyline. She was staring at her phone screen, watching her carefully constructed world collapse in real-time notifications. Frozen assets. Fraud investigation. Legal proceedings initiated. This is impossible, she whispered, her manicured fingers trembling as she scrolled through the emergency alerts from her financial advisors. This is absolutely impossible. David burst through her office doors without knocking, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his tie askew. Victoria, tell me you've seen the news. Tell me this is some kind of mistake. She looked up at him, this man she'd seduced away from his quiet wife, this architect she'd chosen because he was successful but not brilliant, malleable but not weak. David, sit down. We need to think clearly. Think clearly. David's voice cracked. My business partner just called. Meridian is naming me in a fraud lawsuit for $40 million. $40 million, Victoria. My firm is finished. My reputation is... He stopped mid-sentence, staring at her. You said the geological reports were handled. You said everything was legitimate. Victoria's smile was sharp as broken glass. Everything was handled. The inspectors were paid, the reports were filed, the officials were bought. Someone would have to have inside access to prove otherwise. When have you seen someone blame everyone except themselves when things went wrong? How did it make you feel? The silence stretched between them like a chasm. David's face went through a series of emotions. Confusion, realization, then something close to horror. Elena, he breathed. Your wife couldn't possibly. She had my passwords. David sank into the leather chair across from Victoria's desk, his hands covering his face. Jesus Christ, she's had my work passwords for 15 years. I never thought. She never seemed interested in business, never asked questions. You're telling me your housewife brought down a $40 million development deal? Victoria's voice was ice over steel. She's not a housewife, David said quietly, and for the first time, he seemed to be remembering something important. She has an MBA from Wharton. Graduated summa cum laude. She managed all our finances, our investments. I just never paid attention because she never made it about herself. Victoria stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The city below looked different now, not like her kingdom, but like a chessboard where someone else had been making moves while she wasn't paying attention. We can fight this. I have lawyers' connections. This is about one woman's hurt feelings, not actual fraud. Actually fraud. David's voice was hollow. Victoria, we did commit fraud. The soil reports, the geological surveys, we buried evidence that could have gotten people killed. And Elena has proof of all of it. We did what we had to do to make the deal work. Victoria's composure finally cracked. Do you have any idea what it's like to be a woman in this industry? To fight for every contract, every opportunity? I built my company from nothing after my husband died, and I won't let some bitter wife destroy it because her husband chose better. David looked at her then, really looked, and something in his expression shifted. Chose better. Victoria, what did I actually choose? You chose power. Success. A woman who understands ambition. I chose someone who lies to clients and bribes officials. David's voice was getting stronger, clearer. I chose someone who would risk people's lives for profit. I chose someone who would help me destroy my marriage and my integrity for a development deal. Have you ever had a moment where you suddenly saw someone's true character? How did it change how you felt about them? Victoria whirled around, her carefully controlled mask finally slipping. Don't you dare judge me. You signed those reports. You approved those plans. You were happy to take the money when everything was going well. You're right, David said, standing up. I did all of that. But I did it because I thought I was following someone who knew what she was doing. Someone who had control. He gestured at the chaos of papers and phone calls surrounding them. Does this look like control to you? We can still salvage this. Transfer the remaining assets before the full freeze takes effect. Get to Monaco. And become fugitives. David laughed, but there was no humor in it. Victoria, it's over. Elena didn't just expose our business dealings. She exposed what we really are. Victoria's phone rang. Her lawyer. She answered with sharp efficiency, but David watched her face pale as she listened. When she hung up, her voice was barely a whisper. They've frozen everything. Every account, every property. The Monaco house, the art collection, even my personal checking account. She looked at David with something like desperation. I have $3,000 in cash and a credit card that's probably maxed out. David felt something strange washing over him. Not panic like he'd expected, but an odd kind of relief. 4 months, he'd been living in Victoria's world of endless luxury and constant pressure, where every decision was calculated for maximum advantage. Now, stripped of the money and the power and the illusions, he felt lighter somehow. What are we going to do? Victoria asked, and for the first time since he'd known her, she sounded uncertain. Vulnerable. Human. David looked out at the city, thinking of Elena in there, her house, probably making dinner for one and reading a book in the silence he'd shattered. Thinking of 15 years of quiet mornings and shared dreams and a woman who had supported him when he had nothing, who had loved him when he was nobody special. I don't know what you're going to do, he said finally. But I think I need to go home. Home? Victoria's voice was sharp with panic. David, we're in this together. We have to figure out how to fight this together. David turned back to her, and something in his eyes had changed. Victoria, I don't think I have a home anymore. But I think I need to find out if it's possible to build one. He left her standing at the window, staring out at a city that no longer belonged to her, holding a phone that kept ringing with more bad news. And for the first time in months, David Matthews began to remember who he used to be before he'd convinced himself that wasn't enough. The law offices of Whitman, Steele and Associates smelled like leather and old money, but the conference room where Elena sat felt more like a battlefield. Across the mahogany table, David fidgeted with his wedding ring, a habit she'd noticed 15 years ago when they were broke graduate students worried about rent. Now he was a defendant in a $40 million fraud case, and he was still twisting that ring. Before we begin, Attorney Sarah Whitman announced, setting down a stack of documents thick enough to stop a bullet, I need to inform all parties that due to the complexity of the asset freeze and the interconnected nature of the financial irregularities, this deposition process may take several days. Several days. Elena felt her stomach clench. She glanced at David, saw him close his eyes briefly. Victoria, perfectly composed in a black Chanel suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, simply nodded as if spending days trapped in legal proceedings was just another Tuesday. Mrs. Matthews, the attorney continued, as the primary whistleblower and key witness, your presence is required for the duration. Mr. Matthews, as co-defendant, you'll need to remain available for cross-examination. Mrs. Sterling, same applies to you. Elena watched David's jaw tighten. 3 days ago, he'd been planning a new life in Monaco. Now he was trapped in a conference room with the wife he'd abandoned and the woman who'd helped him destroy his integrity. Furthermore, Attorney Whitman added, consulting her notes, due to the asset freeze, neither Mr. Matthews nor Mrs. Sterling currently has access to funds for hotel accommodations. The court has arranged for supervised housing at the Brookfield under judicial oversight. When have you been forced to confront someone you've hurt when you couldn't escape? What was that experience like? Victoria's composure finally cracked. Supervised housing? Like criminals. Like defendants in a major fraud case whose assets are frozen pending investigation, the attorney replied calmly. Mrs. Matthews, of course, is free to return to her own residence each evening. Elena felt every eye in the room turn to her. For 15 years, she'd been the accommodating wife, the one who made everyone comfortable, who smoothed over awkward moments. The old Elena would have offered to pay for David's hotel, would have found a way to make this easier for everyone. The new Elena said, "I'll be staying at the Brookfield Inn as well. For convenience." The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the air conditioning humming in the walls. "Elena," David said quietly, speaking her name for the first time since he'd walked out. "You don't have to." "I want to," she interrupted, not looking at him. "This case is important to me. I want to be nearby." What she didn't say was that she wanted to watch their faces when they realized the scope of what she'd uncovered. What she didn't say was that seeing them stripped of their power and luxury and forced into a budget motel felt like a kind of justice she hadn't known she needed. The Brookfield Inn was exactly what Elena had expected. Clean but basic, the kind of place that charged by the week and asked no questions. The kind of place David Matthews had never imagined he'd stay in again after his first architecture job. She checked in first, requesting room 237. David got 238. Victoria got 235. As Elena unpacked her single suitcase in a room that would have fit inside Victoria's walk-in closet, she heard voices through the thin walls. David and Victoria, their first real conversation since their world imploded. "This is temporary," Victoria was saying, her voice tight with control. "My lawyers are working on unfreezing at least enough for basic expenses." "Victoria." David's voice was tired. "Look around. Really look. This is what we deserve." Deserve. The word came out like a slap. "David, we're not the victims here. Your bitter little wife set us up. She's been planning this for months, playing the wounded martyr while she destroyed our lives." Elena pressed her ear to the wall, hating herself for eavesdropping but unable to stop. "She's not bitter," David said, and something in his tone made Elena's breath catch. "And she's not little. God, Victoria, how did I convince myself she was small?" Elena graduated summa cum laude from one of the best business schools in the country. She managed our entire financial life for 15 years. She turned our modest savings into enough wealth that I could start my own firm. So what? She's smart with money. That doesn't excuse. It doesn't excuse what we did either. David's voice was getting stronger. "We committed fraud, Victoria. We risked people's lives for profit. Elena didn't set us up. She exposed us. Have you ever realized that the person you thought was weak was actually the strongest person you knew? How did that realization change you?" Elena sank onto the narrow bed, surprised by the tears on her cheeks. Through the wall, she heard Victoria's sharp heels pacing back and forth. "Fine," Victoria snapped. "She's brilliant. She's justified. She's morally superior. Does that make you feel better about losing everything?" "Actually," David said, and Elena heard the creak of bed springs as he sat down. "Yeah, it does." A door slammed. Victoria storming out. Elena heard David's door open, then close again. Then footsteps in the hallway, stopping outside her room. A soft knock. "Elena, I know you're there." She wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door. David stood in the hallway in jeans and a t-shirt, clothes she hadn't seen him wear in years. Without his expensive suits and styled hair, he looked younger, more like the man she'd married. "I wanted to." He started, then stopped. "Can I just say something?" Elena stepped back, letting him enter. The room felt impossibly small with both of them in it. "I was wrong," he said simply. "About everything. About you, about what mattered, about who I wanted to be." He looked around the modest room, then back at her. "I convinced myself you were holding me back from success. But you weren't holding me back from success. You were trying to keep me from losing my soul." Elena felt her chest tighten. "David, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even deserve a conversation. But I needed you to know that I finally understand what I threw away." He paused at the door. "And I understand why you had to stop us." After he left, Elena sat on the edge of the narrow bed, staring out the window at the parking lot where David's BMW sat next to Victoria's disabled Bentley. Both cars they could no longer afford to maintain. For the first time in months, she wondered if justice and healing could exist in the same heart. And for the first time since David left, she wondered if the man she'd married was still somewhere inside the one who'd betrayed her. Tomorrow, the depositions would continue. Tomorrow, she would have to sit across from both of them and recount every detail of their betrayal. But tonight, in this small room that felt more honest than her marble mansion, Elena Matthews began to consider the possibility that some broken things might still be worth trying to understand, even if they could never be fixed. The motel's vending machine hummed in the fluorescent-lit hallway at 2:47 a.m., casting strange shadows as Elena fed quarters into it for a Diet Coke she didn't really want. Sleep had been impossible. Too many thoughts, too many memories stirred up by David's unexpected honesty. She was reaching for her drink when she heard the soft sobbing from room 235. Victoria. Elena stood frozen, her hand on the cold can. In all the months she'd watched Victoria Sterling command boardrooms and seduce her husband, she'd never imagined the woman capable of tears. The sound was raw, desperate. The kind of crying that came from somewhere deep and broken. Against her better judgment, Elena knocked softly on the door. The sobbing stopped instantly. "Go away, David." "It's Elena." A long pause. Then the sound of locks turning. Victoria opened the door wearing a hotel bathrobe, her perfect makeup streaked, her silver hair disheveled. She looked older, smaller, more human than Elena had ever seen her. "Come to gloat." Victoria's voice was hoarse. "No," Elena said quietly. "I came to see if you were okay." Victoria laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. "Okay. I've lost everything. My company, my homes, my reputation. In 3 days, I'll probably be in federal prison." She gestured Elena into the small room. "But you already knew that would happen, didn't you?" Elena sat in the single chair by the window. "I knew there would be consequences. I didn't think about this." Victoria curled up on the bed, pulling the thin blanket around herself like armor. "Do you want to know why I did it? Why I seduced your husband? Why I built my empire on lies and bribes?" Elena wanted to say no, wanted to leave this broken woman to her misery and return to her own room. But something in Victoria's voice, the same desperate note she'd heard in her own voice months ago, kept her in the chair. "My husband died 12 years ago," Victoria began, her voice steady but empty. "Richard Sterling, tech genius, billionaire, the love of my life. We met when I was 25 and he was 40. I thought I was so sophisticated, so ready for his world of power and money." She laughed bitterly. "I was a secretary from Ohio who thought love was enough." Elena felt something shift in her chest. What happened? Cancer. Sudden, aggressive, unstoppable. He went from diagnosis to gone in 8 months. Victoria's fingers twisted the blanket. "But before he died, he told me something. He said I was the only person who had ever loved him for who he was, not what he could provide. He said I made him feel human." The silence stretched between them, filled with the hum of the air conditioner and distant traffic. After he died, his business partners circled like vultures. "They'd tolerated me when Richard was alive, but a secretary with a stake in a billion-dollar company? They tried everything to push me out. Said I didn't understand business, didn't belong in their world, should take my inheritance and disappear." Elena found herself leaning forward. "But you didn't." "I couldn't." Victoria's voice grew stronger. "Richard had built something beautiful, something that helped people. His partners wanted to strip it for parts and sell to the highest bidder. So I fought. I learned. I became ruthless because that was the only language they understood. Victoria looked at Elena then, really looked at her. But somewhere along the way, I stopped fighting for Richard's legacy and started fighting for power itself. I told myself I was protecting what he built, but really I was just terrified of being powerless again. Of being that secretary from Ohio who didn't belong. Elena felt her throat tighten. Victoria. When I saw your husband, successful and ambitious but still hungry for more, I saw an opportunity. Not just for another deal, but for someone who would validate that I belonged in that world. Someone who would choose me over. She gestured vaguely. Over the kind of woman I used to be. Elena stared at her. You mean someone like me? Victoria nodded, tears starting again. Someone real. Someone who loved without agenda. Someone Richard would have respected. Her voice broke completely. I destroyed your marriage because I was jealous of what you had with David. The kind of love I had with Richard and thought I'd lost forever. Elena sat back in her chair, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her. For months, she'd imagined Victoria as a predator, a cold manipulator who collected other women's husbands like trophies. She'd never considered that Victoria might be running from the same kind of loneliness that had nearly consumed Elena herself. The fraud, the bribes, all of it, Victoria continued. It started as legitimate business, I swear. But when problems arose, I couldn't bear the thought of failing, of proving them right that I didn't belong. So I cut corners. Then I cut bigger corners. Then I was in so deep that I convinced David to help me dig deeper. Elena closed her eyes, thinking of David twisting his wedding ring in the conference room, of the man she'd married who'd once spent 3 days sketching designs for a homeless shelter they'd never be paid to build. He's not a bad man, Victoria said quietly. Your husband. He got caught up in my desperation, my need to prove myself. I convinced him that success required moral compromises, that everyone at our level bent the rules. He still made his choices, Elena said. Yes. But I made mine first. And mine created the situation where his became inevitable. Victoria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Elena, I'm sorry. Not because I got caught, not because I'm going to prison, but because I let my fear turn me into someone Richard would have been ashamed to know. Elena stood up slowly, her mind reeling. At the door, she turned back. Victoria. That woman you used to be. The secretary from Ohio who loved without agenda? She's still in there somewhere. After Elena returned to her room, she sat on the narrow bed thinking about the woman she'd just left. Victoria Sterling, tech mogul, billionaire, the woman who'd stolen her husband, was really just another version of Elena herself. Someone who'd loved deeply, lost tremendously, and made desperate choices trying to protect what remained of her heart. The difference was that Elena had chosen justice over revenge, truth over power. But looking back at the path that had led her here, Elena wondered if she might have made different choices under different circumstances. If she'd lost David to death instead of betrayal, would she have been strong enough to honor his memory? Or would she have become someone Richard Sterling would have been ashamed to know? Tomorrow, the depositions would continue, and all their secrets would be laid bare in legal documents and court transcripts. But tonight, Elena Matthews had learned something unexpected about the nature of enemies and the thin line between justice and revenge. And she had learned that sometimes, understanding your enemy was the first step toward understanding yourself. The Brookfield Inn's continental breakfast was a study in budget hospitality. Stale pastries, watery coffee, and plastic chairs that had seen better decades. Elena sat alone at a corner table, picking at a blueberry muffin while reading case documents on her laptop. The morning light streaming through dusty windows felt different somehow, softer than it had in months. Mind if I sit? Elena looked up to find David holding a cup of coffee, his hair still damp from the shower. He looked nervous, uncertain, emotion she hadn't seen on his face in years. "It's a free country," she said, then immediately regretted the coldness. Something about last night's conversation with Victoria had shifted something inside her, made her armor feel heavier than necessary. David sat carefully, like he was approaching a wild animal. "I couldn't sleep after our talk yesterday." "Which part kept you awake? The fraud charges or the moral reckoning?" He almost smiled at that. "Both. But mostly I kept thinking about the woman I married. Wondering when I stopped seeing her clearly." Elena closed her laptop, giving him her full attention for the first time in months. "When did you stop seeing me, David?" He was quiet for a long moment, stirring sugar into coffee that probably didn't need it. "I think it was gradual. Success has a way of making you forget what actually got you there. I started believing I'd built everything myself, that my achievements were solely mine." He looked up at her. "I forgot that every major decision I made, every risk I talked through with you first. You weren't just supporting me, you were partnering with me. And I reframed that as dependence instead of strength." "When did you realize that the person closest to you was actually your greatest strength, not a limitation? Share that moment of clarity." Asterisk. Elena felt something loosen in her chest. "You made me feel invisible. Like my opinions didn't matter, like my intelligence was just a convenient tool for managing household finances." "God, Elena." David's voice was rough. "You're the smartest person I've ever known. In graduate school, you saw solutions to engineering problems that stumped my professors. You turned our $20,000 savings into enough capital for me to start my own firm. You." He stopped, shaking his head. "How did I convince myself you were holding me back?" Before Elena could answer, Victoria appeared at their table, looking fragile in yesterday's wrinkled clothes. "I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to get coffee." Elena surprised herself by saying, "Sit down, Victoria." Victoria hesitated, then pulled out the third chair. The three of them sat in an awkward triangle, surrounded by the mundane sounds of other hotel guests starting their day. "I owe you both apologies," Victoria said quietly. "But I don't know how to apologize for destroying lives." "Start with honesty," Elena said. "Last night was a beginning." David looked between them. "What happened last night?" Elena and Victoria exchanged a glance. Two women who had shared something raw and real in a fluorescent-lit motel room. "We talked," Elena said simply. "Victoria told me about Richard," Elena continued, watching David's face carefully. "About how she built her empire trying to honor his memory, and how that mission got corrupted by fear." David leaned back in his plastic chair. "Fear of what?" "Of being powerless again," Victoria answered. "Of proving that I really was just a secretary who got lucky. Of admitting that Richard's love might have been the only thing that made me special." Elena felt her heart twist. "That's not true, Victoria." "Isn't it?" Victoria's smile was sad. "Look where my ambition got us. Prison sentences and destroyed lives. Have you ever seen someone's greatest wound become their greatest source of empathy? Tell us about a time when pain became connection." Asterisk. "No," Elena said firmly. "Your ambition wasn't the problem. Your fear was. Richard fell in love with you for a reason. He saw something in that secretary from Ohio that his business partners never bothered to look for." David was staring at Elena. "You're defending her? After everything?" Elena looked at her estranged husband, then at the broken woman who had helped destroy her marriage. "I'm seeing her. Really seeing her. The same way I wished you would see me." The silence that followed felt different from the tense pauses of the past few days. This silence had weight, substance. It felt like the moment before something important was said. "Elena," David said finally, "I know I have no right to ask this, but is there any part of you that could ever forgive me? Not for Victoria's sake, not for some fantasy reconciliation, but just for peace." Elena studied his face, looking for the calculation she'd grown so familiar with, the sense that his words were chosen for effect rather than truth. But all she saw was exhaustion, regret, and something that looked like genuine remorse. "I've been angry for so long," she said slowly. Anger was easier than grief. But last night, talking to Victoria, I realized something. You didn't just betray our marriage, David. You betrayed yourself. The man I married would never have signed those fraudulent reports. He would never have risked people's safety for profit. "That man is still in there somewhere," Victoria said quietly. "I saw him sometimes when you talked about your early projects, about the homeless shelter you designed for free. I saw him fight against what I was asking him to do." David's eyes filled with tears. "I told myself I was evolving, becoming more sophisticated. But really, I was just becoming someone I didn't recognize." Elena reached across the table and touched his hand, the first physical contact they'd had in months. "The question is, David, can you find your way back to who you were? Not for me, not to save our marriage, but for yourself." "I want to try," he whispered. Victoria watched them, something like wonder in her expression. "Even after everything we did, you're still trying to heal instead of destroy." "Destruction is easy," Elena said. "Healing takes courage." She stood up, leaving her hand on David's for just a moment longer. "I'm going to walk outside. Think about things. You're both welcome to join me if you want." As Elena stepped into the morning air, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Possibility. Not the possibility of returning to what was, that marriage was gone forever, but the possibility of building something new from the rubble. Maybe not together, maybe not in the way any of them expected, but something honest and real and worth the effort. Behind her, she heard David and Victoria talking quietly, their voices missing the sharp edges of desperation and blame. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, Elena Matthews allowed herself to hope that justice and mercy might be able to coexist after all. The sun was fully up now, warming her face as she walked across the parking lot, and Elena realized that some kinds of wealth couldn't be stolen, frozen, or lost in legal proceedings. Some kinds of wealth grew stronger when you gave them away. Elena was folding her clothes into her suitcase when the knock came. Soft, urgent, familiar. She opened the door to find David, his face pale and strained. "Elena, we need to talk. Now." Something in his tone made her stomach drop. "What's wrong?" "Victoria's gone." The words hit her like cold water. "Gone? What do you mean gone?" David pushed past her into the room, running his hands through his hair, the old nervous gesture she'd seen 1,000 times during their marriage. She left in the middle of the night, took whatever cash she had left and disappeared. Elena sank onto the bed. "David, she's a defendant in a federal fraud case. She can't just leave. She can if she doesn't care about the consequences." David's voice was tight. "Elena, there's more. She left something for you." He handed her an envelope, thick and cream-colored, expensive even in their current circumstances. Elena's name was written across it in Victoria's precise handwriting. Inside was a letter and a small digital drive. When someone you'd started to trust betrayed that trust, how did it change your ability to believe in people? Share your experience. Asterisk. Elena's hands trembled as she read. Asterisk, Dear Elena. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. I know how this looks. like I used your compassion as cover for another escape, another betrayal. Maybe that's exactly what this is. I honestly don't know anymore. What I do know is that I can't face prison. Not because I'm afraid of the physical discomfort, but because I'm afraid of who I'll become in there. I've spent 12 years building walls around the woman Richard loved, and prison will either tear those walls down or make them permanent. I can't risk either outcome. The drive contains everything. Every document, every email, every piece of evidence about the fraud that you don't already have. Bank account numbers, shell company structures, bribes paid and received. Enough to ensure that every person we hurt gets their money back and then some. But Elena, there's something else on that drive. Something that will destroy David completely. 3 months before Richard died, David came to me with a proposal. Not for the Sterling development, that came later. This was about the Riverside project, your first case against us. David approached me because he'd already identified the geological problems. He wanted to partner with me to hide them because he knew the profit potential was too enormous to pass up. I said no initially. Richard was still alive then, still keeping me honest. But David persisted. He showed me how much money we were leaving on the table by being naive about environmental regulations. He convinced me that everyone bent the rules at our level. Elena, your husband wasn't seduced into fraud. He was the architect of it. I'm not innocent. God knows I'm not innocent. But David was never the victim of my manipulation. I was the victim of his. The man you've been trying to forgive. The man you've been hoping to help find his way back to who he was? He never lost himself, Elena. This is who he's always been when the stakes were high enough. I'm telling you this not out of spite, but out of love. You deserve to know the truth before you waste more of your beautiful heart on someone unworthy of it. The drive also contains proof of something else. David has been systematically moving marital assets into hidden accounts for the past year. Not because he planned to leave you for me, that was just convenient timing. Because he planned to leave you broke no matter what happened. You exposed our fraud, Elena, but you never discovered his insurance policy against you. I hope someday you can forgive me for all of this. For the affair, for the fraud, for running away, and most of all for having to be the one to tell you who your husband really is. The woman you were kind to in a motel hallway deserved better than this. But the woman who's strong enough to bring down a $40 million fraud scheme deserves to know the whole truth. With respect and regret, Victoria asterisk. Have you ever discovered that someone you thought you knew was completely different? How did that revelation change everything for you? Asterisk. Elena read the letter twice, her hands steady even as her world collapsed again. David stood by the window, his back to her, and she realized he'd been too quiet during her reading. You knew, she said. He turned around, and his face confirmed everything. No surprise, no shock, no confusion. Just resignation. Elena. You knew she was going to run. You probably helped her plan it. Elena stood up, the letter still clutched in her hands. This whole thing, the remorse, the apologies, the wanting to find your way back to who you were, it was all performance. That's not true. Which part isn't true, David? The part where you initiated the fraud? The part where you've been hiding our assets for a year? Or the part where you manipulated a grieving widow into thinking she was corrupting you when really you were corrupting her? David's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. Fine. Yes, I started it. Yes, I convinced Victoria to go along with it. And yes, I protected myself financially because I knew eventually you'd figure it out and try to take everything. His voice grew colder, more like the man she'd been living with for the past 2 years without realizing it. You want the truth, Elena? The truth is that you were holding me back. Your moral superiority, your need to do everything the right way. It was limiting. Elena felt something die inside her chest. Moral superiority. David, I supported you through everything. Every dream, every failure, You supported the version of me you wanted me to be. David's mask was completely off now. The struggling idealist, the man who cared more about homeless shelters than profit margins. But that man was broke, Elena. That man couldn't give you the life you deserved. I never asked for. You didn't have to ask. I saw how you looked at houses in better neighborhoods, how you smiled when we could finally afford nice restaurants, how proud you were when I started making real money. David was pacing now, his voice rising. You loved the benefits of my success, but you wanted to pretend your hands were clean of how I achieved it. Elena stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time in years. Maybe for the first time ever. You're rewriting history. You're making me responsible for choices you made in secret. I made those choices for us. For our future. No, Elena said quietly, her voice cutting through his anger like a blade. You made those choices for your ego. And then you let me discover them so I could be the villain who destroyed your life, instead of you having to face what you'd become. The silence that followed was absolute. David stood frozen in the middle of the room, his mouth open as if to argue, but no words came. Elena walked to the door and opened it. Get out. Elena, please. Get out. Her voice echoed off the motel walls. Get out and don't you ever contact me again. After he left, Elena sat on the narrow bed holding Victoria's letter and the drive that contained the evidence of her husband's complete betrayal. The woman she'd been 24 hours ago, the woman who'd started to believe in redemption and second chances, felt like a stranger. David hadn't lost himself in Victoria's web of ambition and fear. He'd found her specifically because she could give him cover for the man he'd always wanted to be. Elena plugged in the drive and began reviewing the files. Every document confirmed Victoria's letter. Every transaction revealed David's calculated deception. Every hidden account proved that while Elena had been fighting for justice, David had been planning her financial destruction. But as she scrolled through the evidence, Elena realized something that would have broken the woman she'd been yesterday. She wasn't surprised. Deep down, in a place she'd been afraid to look, she'd known. The signs had been there for years. The gradual changes, the emotional distance, the way he'd started treating her like an employee instead of a partner. She'd chosen to believe in the man she'd married instead of seeing the man he'd become. And that choice, she realized, was the only thing she needed to forgive herself for. Elena Matthews had been betrayed completely. But this time, she wasn't going to let that betrayal define her. This time, she was going to let it free her. Elena sat in her car outside the law offices of Whitman, Steele & Associates at 6:30 a.m., watching the city wake up through her windshield. In her briefcase lay Victoria's drive, containing enough evidence to ensure David would spend the next decade in federal prison. In her heart lay a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could turn over every file, every hidden account, every piece of damning evidence. She could watch David lose everything. His freedom, his reputation, his future. After what she'd learned about his calculated betrayal, no one would blame her. Justice would be served with interest. Or she could choose a different path entirely. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Elena, it's Victoria. I know you hate me, but I need you to know something. David doesn't deserve your mercy. But you deserve to choose who you become. Not because of him, not in spite of him, but for yourself. Whatever you decide, you've already won. Elena smiled despite everything. Even in exile, Victoria was still trying to manipulate outcomes. But this time, her manipulation felt oddly like encouragement. Have you ever had to choose between revenge and freedom? What did that decision teach you about yourself? At 8 a.m., Elena walked into the conference room where Harrison Meridian and his legal team were waiting. They'd been expecting both David and Victoria for the final deposition. Instead, they got Elena alone, carrying the weight of several lifetimes. "Mrs. Matthews," Harrison stood as she entered. "Where are the other defendants?" "Mrs. Sterling has fled the jurisdiction," Elena said, taking her seat at the head of the table. The position she'd claimed 3 days ago when she'd first revealed the fraud. "Mr. Matthews is no longer relevant to these proceedings." Harrison's eyebrows rose. "I'm sorry." Elena opened her briefcase and removed a single folder. Not Victoria's drive, not the evidence of David's hidden assets, not the proof of his deeper manipulations. Just the original documents she'd brought to this case, the ones that exposed the fraud that could have killed people. "Mr. Meridian, I have what you need to recover your $40 million and prevent a humanitarian disaster. The geological reports, the bribed officials, the shell company structures, everything necessary to make your investors whole and ensure the Riverside district is never developed on unstable ground." She slid the folder across the table. "As for the individuals involved in the fraud, I believe Victoria Sterling's disappearance speaks to her culpability. As for David Matthews—" Elena paused, feeling the weight of her next words. "I believe his involvement was primarily as a manipulated party, not a primary architect." The silence in the room was absolute. Harrison opened the folder, scanning the documents quickly. "Mrs. Matthews, this is substantial evidence, but I have to ask, do you have access to additional materials that might impact our case?" Elena looked at him steadily. "I have access to everything I need to sleep well at night." "When did you realize that your peace was more important than someone else's punishment? How did that realization change you?" After the meeting, Elena sat in her car in the parking garage, holding Victoria's drive in her hands. 40 gigabytes of David's destruction, packaged neatly in a device smaller than her thumb. She could ruin him completely with a single file transfer. Instead, she rolled down her window and dropped the drive into a storm drain. The sound it made, a small splash in dark water, felt like the most expensive noise she'd ever heard. And the most liberating. Her phone rang. "David." "Elena, please, we need to talk. I know how this looks, but—" "David." Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "Stop. I can explain." "You already did. Last night you explained exactly who you are." Elena watched office workers hurrying past her car, everyone rushing toward their own versions of success and failure. "I'm calling to tell you that I've given the prosecutors everything they need to recover the stolen money and prevent people from getting hurt. I've told them that Victoria was the primary architect of the fraud." David's relief was audible. "Elena, thank you. I know I don't deserve. I didn't do it for you, David. I did it for me." Elena started her car. "I'm divorcing you. You'll keep whatever assets you manage to hide. I don't want them. I want nothing from you except your absence from my life." "Elena, wait. I'm not angry anymore, David. I'm not hurt, I'm not seeking revenge, I'm not trying to destroy you. I'm simply done." She could hear him breathing on the other end, could almost picture him trying to formulate his next manipulation. "You spent 15 years convinced I was holding you back from greatness. Now you'll have the rest of your life to discover what that greatness looks like without me." She hung up and blocked his number. That evening, Elena stood in the kitchen of her empty house. The marble countertops, the high-end appliances, all the beautiful things that had felt so cold 3 days ago. But the house felt different now. Not cold, just spacious. Not empty, just ready. She'd lost her marriage, but she'd found herself. She'd lost her illusions about love conquering all, but she'd gained clarity about what love actually required. She'd lost 15 years of her life to a man who'd never truly seen her, but she'd discovered that she was perfectly capable of seeing herself clearly. Elena Matthews opened her laptop and began typing her resignation letter from the life she'd been living and her application to the life she wanted to create. Tomorrow, she would call a realtor about putting the house on the market. She would call her old professor at Wharton about that standing offer to teach business ethics. She would call her sister in Seattle, the one she'd been too busy being the perfect wife to visit. Tomorrow she would begin building a life based on who she actually was instead of who someone else needed her to be. But tonight, for the first time in years, Elena Matthews was going to pour herself a glass of wine, order takeout Chinese food, and read a book in her own house without wondering when someone else was coming home. Tonight, she was going to enjoy her own company and remember why she'd always been enough, even when someone else had convinced her she wasn't. The choice had been hers all along. She just needed to be strong enough to make it. 6 months later, Elena Matthews stood in the doorway of her new classroom at Wharton, watching her business ethics students file in for their final exam. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting the same kind of shadows she'd once watched from her marble kitchen. But these shadows felt warm, alive with possibility. "Professor Matthews?" A young woman lingered after the other students had settled. "I just wanted to thank you for this class. The case study about the Sterling development fraud, it really opened my eyes about the cost of ethical compromises." Elena smiled, adjusting the simple silver bracelet on her wrist, a gift to herself on the day her divorce was finalized. "What did you learn from it, Sarah?" "That sometimes the people who expose fraud aren't heroes seeking justice. They're just people who couldn't live with silence anymore." The student paused. "And that the real victory isn't destroying the people who hurt you. It's refusing to let their choices define yours." After Sarah left, Elena stood alone in her classroom, remembering the woman she'd been in that hotel conference room, clutching evidence like a weapon. How distant that version of herself seemed now. Not worse, just smaller somehow. Focused on what was being done to her instead of what she could create for herself. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown international number. Asterisk, "Saw the article about your appointment to the university's ethics board. Richard would have been proud. Building something beautiful from the wreckage. That's real strength." Elena typed back, asterisk, "I hope you're finding your way to who you were before the fear. Some transformations are worth the journey, no matter how long they take." Asterisk. She didn't expect a response, and she didn't need one. Victoria Sterling was another woman learning to rebuild herself from the ground up, somewhere across an ocean, hopefully remembering what love felt like before it got complicated by power and loss. As for David, Elena had heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved to Portland, started a small residential architecture firm, lost 30 pounds, and looked older but somehow more settled. She felt nothing about this news. Not relief, not satisfaction, not even curiosity. He'd become what she'd always hoped he would, irrelevant to her happiness. A knock on her classroom door interrupted her thoughts. "Professor Matthews?" Elena turned to find a man about her age standing in the doorway, holding a portfolio and looking slightly nervous. He had kind eyes and calloused hands, the kind that belonged to someone who built things with care. "I'm Marcus," he began, then stopped, smiling at his own nervousness. "I'm sorry, I'm Michael Reeves. I teach sustainable architecture in the engineering department. I was wondering if you had a few minutes to discuss a collaboration." Elena gestured to the chair across from her desk. "What kind of collaboration, Professor Reeves?" "Michael, please." He opened his portfolio, revealing drawings and blueprints. "I'm working on a project to design affordable housing for displaced families. People who've lost homes to natural disasters, economic displacement, that kind of thing. The funding is there, but I need someone who understands the ethical implications of how we approach it." Elena leaned forward, studying the designs. They were beautiful in their simplicity, practical but dignified, the kind of architecture that honored the people who would live there. "You want to make sure you're building homes, not just housing," she said. Michael's face lit up. "Exactly. I don't want to create another project that looks good on paper but ignores the humanity of the people it's supposed to serve." He paused, studying her face. "I've read your work on ethical business practices. You understand that real success isn't about profit margins. It's about whether you can sleep at night knowing the impact of your choices." Elena felt something warm settle in her chest. "You know, Michael, I spent 15 years married to an architect who forgot that buildings are supposed to serve people, not the other way around." "Past tense?" he asked gently. "Very past tense." Elena smiled. "I'm much more interested in present tense these days. Tell me more about your project." For the next hour, they talked about sustainable materials, community input, the importance of designing spaces that foster dignity rather than dependence. Michael listened when she spoke, asked questions that showed he valued her expertise, and shared his own ideas without trying to dominate the conversation. When he finally gathered his materials to leave, he paused at the door. "Elena, Professor Matthews, would you maybe like to continue this conversation over coffee? I know a place that makes terrible coffee but has great conversation." Elena laughed, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in years. "I'd like that, Michael. But I should warn you, I've recently discovered I'm much more complicated than I used to think." "Good," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Simple gets boring after a while." After he left, Elena sat at her desk, grading final exams and listening to the sounds of the university winding down for the day. Through her window, she could see students walking across the quad, professors heading home to their families, the endless rhythm of people building their lives one choice at a time. She thought about the morning 6 months ago when she'd watched David load his suitcases into Victoria's Bentley, when she'd smiled because she knew she was about to dismantle everything he thought made him untouchable. She'd been right about her power. She had dismantled everything. But the most important thing she'd torn down wasn't David's empire of lies. It was her own prison of small dreams. Elena Matthews had spent 15 years being someone else's supporting character. Now, at 42, she was finally ready to be the protagonist of her own story. And the first chapter of that story, the one about a woman who chose rebuilding over revenge, teaching over hiding, love over fear, was just beginning. She gathered her papers, turned off the classroom lights, and walked out into the evening air. Tomorrow she would meet Michael for terrible coffee and good conversation. Tomorrow she would continue building something beautiful from the wreckage of what came before. But tonight, Elena Matthews was going home to her small apartment with its mismatched furniture and overflowing bookshelves, where she would cook dinner for one and feel perfectly, completely whole. The most expensive thing she'd ever owned, she realized, was a marriage that had cost her herself. The most valuable thing she'd ever found was the woman she became when she finally stopped apologizing for who she was. And that, Elena thought as she walked toward her car, was a fortune that no one could ever steal, freeze, or take away in legal proceedings. Some kinds of wealth, after all, were built to last.